What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and welcome back to another episode of Poker Hands. Today we're going to be taking a look at two of my favorite hands from yesterday's King of the Hill semifinal matches. But before we jump into those, I want to let you know that this week we have $100 off the PLO Lab if you guys are interested in signing up. That's going to close tomorrow, Friday, so if you're interested in joining the lab, you can check it out in the description below. Alright, let's go ahead and jump into our first hand. This hand is between Brandon Adams and Scott Blumstein, and it's a good one.
Brandon makes 1,800. Our blinds have gone up. The big blind is now $600. Scott likes to make the call with the Jack-8 offsuit.
Our hand begins innocently enough. Brandon Adams raises to $1,800 on the button at $300, $600 blinds. Now, this is a bit larger than a traditional button open and heads up. Normally, you like to go about 2.5 times the big blind, but 3 times the big blind, totally acceptable. Over to Scott, who has Jack-8 offsuit. Not exactly a great hand, and he is facing a pretty large raise, but again, a hand strong enough to play and will have enough equity to continue against a lot of the hands in Brandon's opening range. Anyway, Scott does make the call, and let's take a flop.
$10-7-5. Gutter ball for Scott. Backdoor flush draw for Brandon.
3,200.
The flop comes 10-7-5 with 2 spades. Neither player flops too well, but they both have a little something going. Scott does have a gutter ball and a backdoor spade draw, and Brandon has a backdoor diamond draw and an over as well. So not exactly premium hands, but enough to maybe take a stab. Scott does check over to Brandon, and now he has to decide whether he wants to bet his Queen-8 of diamonds. I would say in general, I would lean towards betting a hand like this. You get a lot of good turns you can barrel. If you turn an open ender, you turn a gutter, you can fire those cards. If you turn a queen, you can now value bet. And if you turn a diamond, you have a hand that picks up a lot of equity and can continue to bluff. He does decide to go ahead and bet, and I like this play, and the action's back over to Scott. Now, gut shots are a bit tricky on boards like 10-7-5 because there are many hands that can make gut shots. Jack-9, Jack-8, 9-6. 8-6 is actually an open-ender, but another straight draw as well. 6-4, another open-ender. 4-3, 6-3. You know, there are many, many straight draws on these boards, so you have to be careful in how you play them. A good general rule is this. The more straight draws there are, the more selective you should be when you do raise. However, Scott should definitely raise a hand like Jack-8 here some of the time. The question is how often. I'm not sure the exact number, but I would say every 3 or 4 times he should be working in a raise. I'm also totally fine with a call, which he does decide to go for. Let's take a turn.
Deuce of spades on the turn. Scott picks up a flush draw to go along with his gutter.
Check.
Check, check.
The turn comes the deuce of spades, which now gives Scott a backdoor flush draw, and Brandon's hand's looking pretty bad. Scott checks over to Brandon. Brandon considers his options. In general, in this situation, you want to bet when you do have more equity. It would be great if he had a hand like Scott's to bluff with, a hand where he can improve on a lot of rivers, and also he blocks some of the flushes his opponent can have. When you have Queen-8 of diamonds, you're probably just going to have to give up. And you might be thinking, Doug, this hand looks pretty standard. Well, what happens next is definitely not.
No, it's a face card. Queen on the river. With just Jack high, I imagine Scott's going to feel somewhat compelled to go for it. He does bet.
3,000.
Shout out to Queen B 902, Twitch streamer stopping by. welcome to the stream.
Raise. 51. 11,500.
A very interesting hand developing here. Scott bets the river, and Brandon decides to raise with his top pair on a board that has a flush out there. There's plenty of other two pairs. Very thin raise here from Brandon.
The river comes an offsuit queen, and now Scott has just jack high on this board. The flushes got in, so he can't bluff with missed flush draws, and while he could have a few lower straight draws, he's oftentimes going to be raising some of those on the flop. So with jack 8, I think you're going to have to go ahead and bet and try and get your opponent off of maybe some king or ace high hands. Unfortunately for Scott, he's going to run right into a queen, and now Brandon has to decide, should he call or should he raise? I do think in Brandon's spot in the river, this situation is rather close. On one hand, your hand is pretty likely to be good against such a small bet, just 30% of the pot. However, if you do raise, you open the door for your opponent to make moves against you. It's fairly clear that Brandon does not have a flush. If he did turn a flush, he's unlikely to check it back on the turn. You can maybe work that in every now and then, but overall, you're not going to be doing it. In fact, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the hand I played against Helmuth, where I rivered straight on a flush board. It's a similar idea. He cannot have a flush here very often because he's going to bet those flushes on the turn. So, should he be raising a queen, even though he's likely good but is beat by a lot of value bets, or should he just be calling? Personally, I think with a weak queen, you should probably just call, and with stronger queens, or queens with a spade, I'd lean a bit more towards going for a raise. Hands where it's less likely that your opponent now has a very strong holding. If you raise every queen, you open the door for your opponent to jam aggressively on you with hands like two pair or sets, as well as all of the flushes. Anyway, Brandon does decide to raise, making it 11.5 thousand to go. Now back over to Scott, and he obviously can't call with just jack high. But he does know his opponent is unlikely to have a flush, so he's considering if he should go all in. I do think in general when you bet the river and someone raises you, if you want a bluff jam, which is fine and you should do it some of the time, you should mainly pick hands that were thin value bet and then use them as bluffs. The reason is that when you get raised, you can let some hands go. So maybe it would make more sense if you decided to bet this river with a hand like ace 7 with the ace of spades, rather than a hand like jack 8 with the 8 of spades. I will say, however, as long as your hand has a spade in it, it's totally fine to be making a move. And I think Scott is going to subscribe to that logic.
Scott moves in. Scott moves in. Foot on the gas pedal.
That's right, guys. He just gave him the Jeremy Kaufman.
It's a lot.
Wow.
Oh my
Didn't
God.
expect that.
Oh my
Somebody probably
God.
should
That's
be to the test.
amazing.
Oh my
That is
God.
amazing.
Oh my God. Jeremy.
Oh, you want to know how much?
No high five, though. You got to have the high five.
You don't say that at the table.
But this is a big pot.
Go fuck yourself.
Now, what can Brandon really do here? He's getting jammed on. He's got a weaker hand he might raise. He could have a queen with a spade, which is a much better call because you block some of the flushes. He could have stronger queens, which isn't really that relevant. And he could maybe have a hand like two pair or flush from time to time. The key here for Brandon is this. He's going to have to sometimes call a queen if he's going to raise all of his queens on the river. And if he wants to give up the ones that have a card like an 8 that might be used in a bluff but never a value bet, that's totally fine. 8 of diamonds, that is. But if he does have a queen with a spade, he's going to have to call. And the important lesson here to take away at home is in spots where you mainly have one pair, you're going to have to make some uncomfortable calls if you're going to raise them for value when you do have some important removal. We all know what the math says. But can Brandon Adams dig deep and find a little bit of white magic?
All of a sudden, Brandon's thin value raise not looking so hot. He will let it go. Oh, uses a reveal, and he's going to get the bad news.
Nice hand.
The bad news. Scott pulls a huge bluff here on the river.
No, that just goes to you.
Gets
Yeah.
Brandon off his top pair, and now moves into a comfortable lead.
Phil, what do you have to say about that?
It's just fucking unreal.
Let's go ahead and jump into our next hand. It was actually played on the other side of the bracket between Olivier, Busquet, and Dan Colman. This is another hand that happens at the 300-600 blind level. Let's jump into the action.
And honestly, I like watching Damian Maya fight.
Yeah, he's cool too.
Yeah.
For sure.
But like, if I had to pick one person, it might honestly just be Wonder Boy.
Wonder Boy.
I love Wonder Boy.
Yeah.
He's amazing.
I can see that. Riz.
I don't follow much MMA, but my favorite fighter is actually, I guess I'd go with Olivier Busquet.
Last I checked, he's still undefeated. Our hand begins completely standard. Coleman elects to open ace-8 on the button. Busquet decides to defend jack-7 suited. Nothing to see here. Let's move on to the flop.
Check.
Check.
So we do have a flop here, 9-7-5. Middle pair for Busquet.
The flop comes 9-7-5, and both players get a little piece. Busquet flops middle pair and a backdoor flush draw, and Coleman flops a gutter ball with ace high. Busquet checks over to Coleman, and now in Coleman's shoes, I do generally like to check this kind of hand back. If you bet and your opponent folds, you were almost always ahead to begin with. You have good playability on different runouts, and when you get raised, it kind of sucks to have this hand. But I don't mind from time to time working in a bet. You do have a lot of equity when you're called, and that way you can improve on some cards that aren't as likely, like an ace, and you can value bet some top pairs. But in general, I lean a bit more towards check. He does decide to bet 1,500, and now Busquet has a crystal clear call, which he makes, and let's take a turn.
Gutter ball for Coleman. I gotta say, the way Coleman's run today,
Check.
Check.
very interesting turn. Coleman picks up a double gutter now, can make a straight on a 10 or a 6. Obviously ace and 8 now dead though. He's gonna fire again, and I honestly think that Busquet is finally gonna catch Coleman. Unless Busquet decides to raise. I really wouldn't like that actually though. I like this call a lot.
The turn comes a jack, creating a backdoor flush draw, and this is an action card. Busquet now has 2 pair, and Coleman has improved to a double gutter. An 8 can make a straight on either a 6 or a 10, which certainly improves his hand's strength. Busquet checks over to Coleman, and now I think with his ace high, bit of a decision is to be made. I don't mind betting again, a little more so. I like it a little more than betting on the flop. You picked up more equity, your hand has less showdown value now, and I like this hand as a turn bet. But I do also think you should be checking it back sometimes on the turn. I know we have another video here where it's a classic case of you can do both things, or maybe even all 3 things in some spots, but it needs to be said because it's true. You want to mix up your lines with these hands and take a bit of both, but I lean towards betting the turn. Coleman decides to fire a healthy bet size $4,500. Now, with 2 pair here for Busquet, I don't really mind a call. I don't really mind a raise. I lean a bit more towards a call, though. There are certainly hands that beat you, and if you put in all the money, you're going to get action from all of them. However, you can definitely get some value by raising. There are many more worse hands that can call you than there are better hands that will as well. So that means it's a bit close between both decisions. I do like a call against people that barrel the river a lot, and a raise more against people that are passive on the river. If you're playing someone that constantly shuts down on the river, a nice way to start countering them might be to raise hands like this on the turn. But watch out and don't get too carried away. If you get too deep, then all of a sudden it gets way too thin, and you don't want to be the guy with 2 pair against a straight or a set. Anyway, Busquet does make the call, and it finally appears Busquet is going to catch Coleman bluffing.
Coleman has been barreling so much. You gotta sometimes set him up.
Check.
Well, there's really only so much you can do. One of these 2 men is but a mere mortal. This is going to absolutely suck for Olivier. And Olivier hates his life.
Good card, man.
This is a really brutal spot now for Olivier. He checks over to Dan, and Dan fires the river, and all of a sudden his 2-pair, which looks so strong, has become very weak. The real problem is this. An 8 is a card that oftentimes will bet flop and bet turn because it will have equity on both streets and possibly not much showdown value. Now, the other problem here are there are hands that Coleman could consider to bluff with. I mean, he could maybe have a hand like 6-4 or 6-3 or Queen 10 or King Queen or King 10. These are all possible holdings that Dan Colman can have when he does fire the river. In fact, this is actually a good lesson for you guys to take away. If you bluff this turn and on this river you hit a pair of 6s, you absolutely want to fire again because you simply have too many other strong hands that can be betting for value. When a card is really good for your range, you want to bet much more aggressively and much more often. When a card is bad, you want to do the opposite and bet less frequently. Now, in this situation, Coleman does have the straight, so it's not too interesting. He should just bet. But when he does have some of those weaker hands, he wants to also make sure to work those in so he keeps his range balanced. In Busquet's shoes, this is a very difficult scenario. I think he's unfortunately just going to have to call. There's maybe some chance that Dan has a worse 2-pair, and if that ever happens, then you absolutely have to make sure you call with hands like this. But additionally, he does not have any of the cards that his opponent might be bluffing with. Dan might value bet with a hand with a jack in it, or value bet with a hand with a 7 in it, but he's not going to be bluffing with those holdings. Those hands make pairs early enough to where they end up being checked, and if he did have a good hand like top pair, top kicker, he's going to check the river because things have gone a little bit too far. I would say that if he had a club in his hand, this would be a slam dunk call, but regardless, you can't get too choosy when your opponent fires the river. Remember, you're going to have to do a lot of defending, and 2-pair is going to have to be in there. Yeah, he's going to have a flush or straight from time to time, but not enough to be able to fold all of his 2-pairs. So even though it's the wrong play, I still would like to see Olivier call.
All right, so we have a new guest here in the booth, getting a little breath of fresh air in the mix. To welcome Matt Glantz to the stream.
What's up, Twitch guys? I had to wake up like Doggy Polk's back here. He's a little sleeping in the corner, in the under the hobbit hole, under the escalator here.
Under the hobbit hole, indeed. By the way, Coleman just managed to hit a gutter ball, turned open ender, river straight against 2-pair. Busquet paid the price for setting the trap.
And that's the way the game works sometimes. You make the right play, but you still lose. Poker's a fun game, isn't it? That's going to do it for us here today. If you guys are interested in checking out the grand finals, which are today, with Brandon Adams taking on Dan Colman, the winner will walk away with $200,000, the loser with nothing. I'm going to be hosting the event, and by the time you see this, it might already be live. It's going to start at 6 p.m. Eastern time. The link is in the description below if you want to stop by and check it out. And make sure you let me know you came from YouTube. I'll give you guys a shout out. See you soon.